Saanich North in the Islands, I think, was up first.
I guess you just got to stay standing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to Bill 22, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Amendment Act. You know, I just want to start. It seems like there's some challenges that this government has with bills numbering 22. I seem to remember going back just over a year ago that, that there were challenges with another Bill 22, in which actually the process, and I know that you want me to speak, Mr. Speaker, to this Bill 22. However, I think that drawing the comparison to the previous bill is an important one, simply because what we see with this bill is the Information and Privacy Commissioner coming out and speaking very, very strongly, very quickly and very strongly, raising concerns about the process, raising concerns about the content, and raising concerns about what this means for the future of freedom of information, the freedom of information in this province. Similarly, we saw the same kind of response from independent people of this House, as well as external groups with the previous Bill 22. And that process for that bill didn't proceed, just as I hope that at this point the process for this Bill 22 also does not proceed. It's not just Michael McAvoy, our Independent Information and Privacy Commissioner, that's come out and spoken strongly with concerns, calling this bill exceedingly troubling, saying that government is effectively asking the Legislative Assembly for a blank check to eliminate the current restrictions on public bodies accessing and storing people's information outside of Canada. But it's also the Executive Director of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, Jason Woiwada, who says that the legislation falls short, calling it a missed opportunity in key areas or the wrong direction. This government keeps saying one thing and doing another. They say they support greater government transparency, but then introduce proposed legislation that leaves major gaps in our existing law unaddressed, end quote. Our colleagues have done a very good job today, and my colleague from Cowichan Valley did a very good job today outlining the extensive work that committees have done, the committees to review this legislation, as it's a part of the requirement of the legislation is to review it on a regular basis. And other members of this House have done a very good job of outlining the recommendations that this government, and indeed former members of those committees who still have seats in this chamber, have ignored the recommendations, the long list of recommendations. And in fact, actually, I wouldn't want to leave anybody to believe that there's too many recommendations that were left by those committees to implement. Maybe that's the reason why this amending legislation ignores the fact that the committee work of the past has left some very specific and detailed recommendations for government to implement, whether it be the previous government that we've heard so much about, or this government, which we've also heard so much about. It doesn't really matter. I agree with my colleague from Cowichan Valley who says that we are just indeed the caretakers, and so we have a current role in this Parliament as members of the opposition to ask these questions and to demand better from government than was before. And if we take the approach where we can learn from the mistakes of previous governments and build towards creating a legislative assembly that's more responsive, that's more accountable, that's more transparent with information, if we can achieve that, then we are in fact moving forward through time rather than just staying in one place, which it appears that this debate does. It's just kind of like playing tennis with a ball back and hitting it back and forth. They're bad, no, they're worse, no, they're bad, and the debate in this House then just deteriorates into meaninglessness, frankly. You know, I think that it's really important to acknowledge the work as others have mentioned, but I want to talk about the work of committees as well, because it has been some of the most rewarding work that I have participated in since getting elected here into this place in 2017. It is the most collaborative work. It's where I think the sides of this legislature break down, and where we can have debate, where we can have discussions, where we can find common ground. It's been a very, very rewarding experience to sit in committee and recognize that actually there's, on many, many issues, maybe not most issues, but many, many issues, there's little difference in the positions of the members of this place. It's not until we sit in these seats in this configuration that we then start to play the political games and the partisan games of pretending like there's great amounts of differences in how we want to approach these things. There isn't really, and that is what is found. Anybody who wants to listen in on a public committee meeting, they will hear how chairs and deputy chairs and members call each other friends and refer to each other as colleagues and look to build each other up, rather than what so often happens in this chamber process of tearing each other down unnecessarily. We still represent this wonderful place that we live and the wonderful places that the 87 seats in this chamber represent. And so when we ignore, when the government that's represented in here ignores committee recommendations, what it does is it works to undermine and erode the good work that committees do. If the committee members go in and believe that their reports that they write, after expending a considerable amount of time and energy out of their schedule, a time that could be taken up doing constituency work or could be doing other work that we have here as MLAs, then they're not going to expend the amount of energy and resources that's necessary to do good committee work. If the public doesn't believe that the recommendations of a committee are going to be taken forward by government and implemented, then why would they participate in the committee process? And all we get out of that entire situation is an erosion of our democracy. It's an undermining of the very place that we work every day. And none of us can afford, especially now, where we've seen so many challenges to our democracy through COVID and an erosion of our democracy, the impact of snap elections in making people feel like here we go again, another election for seemingly no reason, eroding the public trust. And this bill takes a further swipe at that and further erodes the public trust. And so if what we see and what we hear in the debate here is a 2020 recommendations ignored, 2016 recommendations ignored, people will start to not want to participate in a process in which at the outcome is just government moving on with whatever their agenda is at that particular time. And I think that that is what, you know, the most unfortunate comments that I've heard and seen in the media is the minister that's responsible for this bill suggesting that one of the reasons why it's on the table is because members of one side or another use it too often, too frequently, overwhelm. Those are comments that I think are really unfortunate, because it is the role of the opposition, of course, to get information and to ask government questions. So we want to make sure that we are in this place building up the confidence of the work that we do in here, not undermining and eroding it, and making sure that everything we do is toward that. And so, you know, what my worry is because I'm on a couple of other committees here that we've spent a considerable amount of time, working towards what I believe will be comprehensive, thoughtful, engaging recommendations on two very important pieces of legislation that deeply impact British Columbians. And it would be an absolute tragedy if at the end of that process, the ministers responsible for that legislation say, thank you very much, have a nice day, not really interested in your work, going to do whatever we want anyway. And unfortunately, that's what the debate around this bill is starting to paint the picture of. Government uninterested in the work that their peers do in this place, their colleagues do in this place, and just going to push forward with whatever they've come up with on their own. And part of what is, I think, really establishing that as the reality here in this, as we're debating Bill 22, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Amendment Act, is that one of the committees that I'm currently on right now is the Special Committee to review the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. This was a committee that was struck last December. It was a committee that was struck again this past summer on June 16th. The government House Leader moved the creation of the special committee. The government appointed members to the committee. They gave the committee powers to create subcommittees. They gave the committee powers to conduct public consultations. And they asked the committee to report back by June 2022, 1 year, basically 1 year from when that committee was struck. One of the most important aspects of that committee work, of course, is opening the discussion up for British Columbians in a very public way to contribute to the improvement of the legislation. Whether it be stakeholders who have a special interest or a special understanding of the legislation and how it applies to them, whether it be the public who are just engaging the legislation for the first time and have some interest in it and want to provide some comments. What I've learned in the committee process is that there is a wide range of people that engage that process, and they engage it for a variety of different reasons. And what this government is doing by moving this legislation forward now, the way it's been moved forward, is they're undermining the process that they created. And I have to believe, I have to ask the question. Either it was a move to disrespect that process, or it was just simply one part of government not talking to another part of government. We have a process in which the government House Leader strikes a committee, and then a minister in a ministry just moving ahead with legislation on their own. The picture that it paints for British Columbians is that this government is clumsy and uncoordinated. Because what are we to debate or to discuss now in this committee? How are we to believe that this government is going to open this legislation up in any major way other than maybe minor amendments through miscellaneous amendments bills in the future? So we're going to get through a process where we have to report back, and frankly, we've already burned a quarter of a year without getting into the meat of it. But that makes no difference. The committee is sitting. The members we've met. And yet, here we are debating legislation, much of which is, as my colleagues in here have pointed out, much of which is very controversial. Aspects of this which we could get thorough public input and comment on and give good quality direction, nonpartisan direction from this whole House to government. Instead now we have to maybe have a discussion about information that has just been amended. If this government has its way and uses its majority to just push this legislation through despite all of this effort that we're putting into it. This is really a test for those backbenchers of the government side of this House, really, when it comes down to it. Maybe they will take the opportunity that is afforded by this lengthy second reading debate to actually go through and understand the implications of this legislation that they're being asked to stand in support of. I hope they do. Because the reality of the impact of this legislation is not minor, just like the work of the committees is not minor. And it's not just the members of this legislature that have to meet on a regular basis to do the work. It's not just the members of the public who have to prepare their comments to the committee, but it's all the other parts of the apparatus of this place that also have to ramp up their support for that committee work. So it's not just disrespectful to the members that have been appointed to the committee, but it's disrespectful to the staff of this legislative assembly. It's disrespectful to the clerk's office, who have to put research staff and clerk staff on that committee. It's disrespectful to our friends at Hansard, because they also have to put people and find a way that when government calls a committee, everybody else has to find a way to make it happen for us. And I deeply appreciate the fact that when government calls a committee, the staff of this legislative assembly make it happen. And nothing could be clearer than when COVID hit and we had to make it happen, where they had to make it happen, and they did. But it's not something that we should just take for granted. And it's not something that we should think is light work. It's an effort. And it's an effort that must be respected. In this process, moving a piece of amending legislation in the middle of a review by a special committee is disrespectful to the entire process. So, I think I want to make some comments with respect to arguments about one party using this more, or one individual using this more. And I just want to really, I think, agree and emphasize the comments that my colleague from Cowichan Valley made. The reality of proactive disclosure, the reality of putting the information out and being transparent at the front end, really, I think, allows for us on the opposition benches, and allows for the media and allows for the public to be able to do the job of holding their government accountable. It's a democracy. We don't elect members of the government side of the House, government, to then just rule us without any accountability for the next 4 years until we have the benefit of yet another election. That's not how this should work. But that's how this looks. This looks like they don't like it. The government doesn't like having to answer questions. The government doesn't like having to be able to be held accountable for the decisions they make. The government doesn't want to talk about the process with how they arrived at the decision that they made. And so they tighten up the information that is not their information. They are stewards of that information, and they must be able to make it available to the public freely. And that's not what's happening in this legislation. Freedom of information is not free. There is a charge for it. There is a charge for people to get information about the operations of 2,900 government bodies. And the government says that they did a consultation of those 2,900 public bodies covered by this legislation, and that they've called it, you know, a good deep consultation, good consultation, or whatever the language was. And then on the Engage BC website, over 75 organizations participated. 75 organizations, 2,900 public bodies are covered by this legislation. 29 organizations participated. 1,700 individual responses to Gov Together BC, 800 individual responses to the Ipsos survey. And I think what's important to acknowledge is that there were two key themes that were canvassed in that, and one was service modernization, and the other was privacy enhancement. Nowhere was there a conversation about transparency, and in fact, the people and the organizations that have reached out to us were shocked that this legislation came forward based on the fact that there wasn't a detailed conversation or request for information on transparency. I think it's important to also acknowledge the impact that the removal of data residency, data sovereignty could have for British Columbians. And I think that it's safe to say that the data that we create in here, we take every effort to store it here, in this country. Why? Why do we do that? We do it because it then then our laws apply to it. And so, I think that before government and before the backbenchers and the members of the NDP caucus stand up to unanimously support this, they need to carefully consider and think about whether or not they've asked enough British Columbians if this matters to them. Whether or not the 29 or 75 organizations, the 1,700 individuals, whether or not that is a fair representation of British Columbians. Because I can tell you the committee work would have been a much better way of being able to gauge over a much longer period of time, in a much more detailed and thorough way, whether or not British Columbians are okay with this change. So here we are in August, government's proposed it. I would imagine British Columbians, I can imagine that some British Columbians are going to be confused because some of them might be getting ready to make comments about this to a committee. Now they've found out that, well, that process isn't going to be available to them, or it could be available to them, but what's the point? And then now the government's just changed it. And so now the comments will have to be, well, we need to change it back. And it's just sloppy and uncoordinated. And if the government wanted to or needed to make changes because of timing, which was one of the arguments, that there's aspects of this under a ministerial order that need to be changed because the ministerial order is going to be expiring soon, fine, fair enough, extend the ministerial order. Expedite the process of the committee. Ask the committee to focus on that part of it because there's a time sensitivity to it. Don't make the change and then use some excuse that, well, we needed to rush this through in the fall session, prior to asking these questions and getting detailed responses from the public through the regular committee process, which has been a regular process, 2010, 2016, 2021. But now it's going to be a conversation as to whether or not those need to be removed. So the final thing that I want to talk about today is just going to be around Section 27 of the legislation. And this is one that I think also, I ask my colleagues in the government side of the House to really take a look at exactly what the minister and the ministry is asking them to approve here with the power to authorize a public body to disregard a request. And, I've asked some questions about this, but I'm very, very concerned that the expansion of this power, the commissioner already can authorize a public body to disregard a request. But what this legislation is doing is expanding the scope under which that commissioner may consider that request. And I'm not going to get into a bunch of examples of what those requests might be, but what I will do is invite my colleagues to think about that themselves, to consider all of the different requests that might come to just disregard a request in this freedom of information. And I think that what we need to be leaning much more towards is that recommendation that my colleague from the Cowichan Valley was talking about, and that was making public information proactively publicly available, rather than expanding the scope by which a commissioner may allow a public body to just disregard a request. And, to say, well, and then leaving it up to the commissioner to determine whether it's frivolous or vexatious. There is already some of this authority, but what this government has done in this legislation, without consultation, without the discussion that would normally happen in a committee, to say, okay, we're just going to expand those powers. So to me, like my colleague has mentioned previously earlier today, I have very serious concerns about what is being proposed here. I have very serious concerns about the timing of when it's being proposed, especially in the context of the fact that I and other members of this legislature are part of a committee that should be doing work exactly on these topics, asking these questions, finding out the advice of the people of this province, so that then we can create recommendations that informs the minister, so that then the minister can draft legislation that reflects the wishes of the public. That's a quality functioning democracy. Not the backwards approach that's happening here. Appoint a committee, appoint it again, meet to appoint a chair and a deputy chair, then bring major amending legislation in the middle of that process. Right in the middle of that process, we have until June 22nd of 2022 to bring those recommendations back. Not only do you undermine the work of that committee, but you undermine the confidence of people that their government is functioning in a way that makes sense. Because none of that process makes any sense at all. What it does is it indicates that the component parts of this government are simply not communicating very well with each other. And that's just embarrassing, really. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to Bill 22. We've got a lot of questions coming in the committee stage of this debate. And with that, I'll take my seat. Thank you.